Okay, so let's get underway. As I'll just give a quick introduction about myself because I don't think, I'm sure there are a lot of people here that I don't know. So just a quick introduction without boring you too much. You can see there on the screen that I obviously give presentations, so I run keynote addresses and so forth. You can see that I'm an author. I've written 19 books, and many of those books are on what I'm going to talk about today, which is about that culture piece that we're here for. And as you can see, I still play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition here in Brisbane, which is a bit sad at my age, and we only play every second week because it takes 2 weeks to recover. So that's a little bit about me, and let's launch into what we're going to cover today. So there's basically three things that I really want to cover. So three broad areas, if you like. And one of those is I just want to talk about culture for a moment because we use the word culture a lot, don't we? And really, what do I actually mean by culture? So let's just get a clarity around what we mean by culture. And in particular, of course, as it relates to the workplace. I'm going to talk about the five conversations framework, which I think is the basis of what I'm proposing here to change culture. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the implementation process. In other words, if you were wanting to implement the five conversations framework in your organization, how would you go about it? What are the steps that are required to do that? Now, you might be here and just want to improve your ability to develop better conversation with your team members. And the five conversations framework will be helpful for you for that reason, that possibility. But for others of you, you might be saying, well, I'd like to implement this in my organization. So I'll address both of those things, of course, as we go. So what do we actually mean by culture? So let's sort of give a sort of a bit of an overview about this. And I'm not going to bore you with lots and lots of definitions around this, but I will say this, that culture is not the posters on the wall or the mission statement in the annual report. So it's not those things. I mean, those things are aspirational, undoubtedly, and in many cases we wouldn't disagree with the values and so forth that we're trying to instill in the organization, but they're not really the culture. It's more of the aspiration of what the culture might look like. What culture really is, in plain English, is it's the lived experience that people create and reinforce in their everyday, every day through their decisions and their conversations and their actions. So it's what people do and how they communicate with each other. And today I want to focus specifically on conversations because I believe that that's the key driver for improving organizational culture. So I'm going to talk obviously about that as such. Okay, so let's talk about, well, why do we have a culture? What is the purpose of that? Some people say my team doesn't have a culture, or that group of people here over there don't have a culture. Any group of people who interact with each other do have a certain culture. And there's a good reason, there's a good there's a reason for that. And as you can see on the screen there, it serves as a sense-making tool. It helps define boundaries. It gives a sense of identity for people, and it gives people a commitment beyond self-interest. And it actually is about stability. You know, we want to know what's appropriate and inappropriate. So there's a whole reason and raft of reasons why we have cultures. The question's not whether we have a culture. The question, of course, is whether we have a productive working culture or whether we have an unproductive working culture, or perhaps, like many, something in the middle. But we all have a culture as such, and there's a good human reason for that, as I've identified there. So I would actually argue that organizations are conversations. If you actually think about it, in your organization, there are, depending on the size, of course, there are potentially hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, or even millions of conversations that go on every day in your workplace. Some of them happen in the boardroom, some of them happen in the lunchroom, some of them happen in the car park, some of them happen in the bathroom. They happen everywhere. And so you could actually think about an organization as a bunch of individuals working towards a common cause. And how they do that is, of course, they have a series of conversations. So we can sort of conceptualize organizations as a series of conversations, if you like. So if we keep that in mind, we might even go a step further and say that conversations are culture. So in other words, the way we communicate with each other, both formally and informally, say perhaps in the team meeting versus in the corridor, or via Zoom or via Teams, or however we like to converse with each other, you could argue that that's actually a really good blueprint of what a culture is in an organization. And that's the approach I'm going to take as we go through our session today. So it does, of course, raise an interesting question. How do you change culture? Now, here's an exercise you might like to try with your team. It's a great exercise, and I've done this across 21 industries at all levels of an organization. And if in your next team meeting, you might like to sit down with your team and you just simply ask them 3 questions. And you'll be surprised at how incredibly effective this is. So you ask them the first question, if you had to describe our team, or if it's a larger group, our organization as a color, what color would it be and why? And then you ask them, if you had to describe our team as an animal, what animal would it be and why? And if you had to describe our team as a motor vehicle, what motor vehicle would it be and why? Now, apart from having a good laugh, because a lot of people come up with some really funny metaphors around colours, animals, and vehicles, you'll find that if you go round the group and you ask each person to identify the colour, animal, and vehicle, but the why, you'll find that there is very similar reasons for that. So that sort of gives you a very quick sense of how people view your culture or how they see the culture of the organization. So that's a really great little exercise to do. You'll enjoy it, your team will enjoy it, and you might even want to take it a step further, actually. And then next time you meet, you might say aspirationally, what color, animal, and vehicle should we be? If we're here, how can we be there? And then the question is, how do we go from A to B? So it's just a simple little exercise. It's very powerful with your team, a lot of fun, and it breaks up perhaps the monotony of a normal reporting meeting. But at any rate, if we come back to the questions that I was commenting on about teams, we do know from evidence, lots of research on this, that we know, and I'm sure you know this anyway, and I'm sure that's why you're here. We do know that a positive culture will improve a number of things. It will certainly improve performance, and it'll certainly improve profitability if it's a private sector organisation. It will certainly improve engagement and retention. There's plenty of research to demonstrate that. And I'm not going to go through all the research here because it'll take us too long. But if you simply Google it or go on to chat, you'll find there's an enormous amount of body of research to demonstrate these things. There's also an indication that it'll improve innovation and adaptability as well. And it'll also improve well-being and sustainability. So there are lots and lots of reasons, good reasons, positive reasons, why changing our culture can make a big difference. Now, many people think it's very difficult to change culture, and in some respects it can be. But I think the way I'm going to demonstrate it today through the conversation approach, it can accelerate and change the culture quite quickly. So there is obviously a lot of evidence that those things occur. Now, you've probably seen these statistics before, and we know that, surveys show that many, well, in this case, this is from Gallup, 77% of people are disengaged at work. Now, by disengaged, they might be passively disengaged. They're not actively disengaged, but nevertheless, they're disengaged. There is And when Gallup did its research, and when these organisations look at this research, they usually look across a series of industries. It demonstrates the same sort of thing, that lots and lots of people have checked out. And of course, that's part of the culture of those organisations. Let's look at that a little bit further. When Gallup actually looked at this last year, they found that in their own research, that 62% of people were not engaged. Now, that's a lot of people. That's a big percentage of people. Probably more disturbing than that was that actively disengaged was probably around 15%. Now, what that means by actively disengaged is that these people are actually actively attempting to undermine the culture. And I'm sure you can think of examples of that in your own workplace or workplaces that you have worked in and interacted with. So that leaves only 23% of people that are engaged. Now, there's a good argument to say that it's up to the individual employee to become engaged, and I think that is a very good argument, and I've got a lot of sympathy for that argument. However, there are lots of things that might disengage people in the workplace that perhaps need not be there. And so what we're trying to do is to create the environment, at least, where people make a choice about being engaged. And hopefully those figures improve from what you're seeing on your screen. Now, my work is around what we call the psychological contract, which sounds a little bit complicated, but psychological meaning in your mind, and contract meaning between two or more people. So there is a contract that goes on in the workplace, and I think this is key to changing culture. And the contract is usually between the manager and the employee. And the problem with this psychological contract is it's not written down. It's not written anywhere. It's something that's in people's heads. So if you think about it, the employee has certain expectations of management. And so a manager, of course, at the same level has certain expectations of employees. Often these things aren't discussed, but they're just in our heads. And if there's a conflict between what the employee and the manager believe that the expectations of the other party are, it's likely to lead to confusion at the very minimum, or what we might call a them and us culture. And the them and us culture is one that's been very prevalent for pretty much over 200 years, since the Industrial Revolution, when people were actually engaged in the workplace. My feeling about this is this hasn't changed much. And I think a lot of organizations say, oh no, we're different. We've got a different psychological contract. We've got a collaborative psychological contract versus a them and us contract. I'm a little skeptical of that in many cases, because these things often aren't discussed, but they're thought about as such. So, for example, let me give you a very practical example. Let's say that you've got a very traditional manager who believes that their job is to make decisions and then get people to follow through on those decisions. So they make unilateral decisions and then they ask their team to get on board with that. And if I have an employee who actually believes that this should be a collaborative decision-making process, there's a conflict instantly, isn't there? Because the employee wants to be involved in decision making and the manager doesn't think that's appropriate. Or you can flip it around and say, imagine if you had a very traditional employee who believed that the manager's job was just to get on with it, make decisions, and I will just passively do what I'm told. So they've got a very traditional view of the psychological contract. And the manager, on the other hand, is very collaborative and wants to try to engage people in those conversations and in that decision making. Well, the manager will try and have these conversations with their team members and find that it's like pulling teeth, because the employee doesn't believe that that's part of their role. So these things go on every day, and this is the contract that continues. So it's really, in my view, about changing this contract to be more collaborative rather than a them and us type culture. So the other thing that and many of you in HR who conduct exit interviews would understand this very well. But people often don't say these things, but people rarely quit just for money. They quit when the psychological contract breaks. Often people say, they don't obviously mention the psychological contract, but they say, well, I've got a poor relationship with my boss, or my boss won't listen to me, or, there's a range of things around that, which is the real reason why they're leaving. When they no longer feel valued or supported, or they see any future in the organisation, they decide to walk. Now, they might give a very good reason for that, that might seem quite palatable, but often if you look scratch between the surface, it's often around their relationship with their manager that is often the problem. In other words, the psychological contract is broken down. So the question then, if you accept what I'm saying about that, is how do we actually get to change this psychological contract? How do we actually improve it? How do we make it more collaborative? How do we make it more less of a them and us type culture that we often see in organisations, or at least in pockets of organisations? I think the answer is very straightforward. It's one conversation at a time. That's how we change the culture. That's how we change the psychological contract. One conversation at a time. Now, it's not any conversation, because, conversations could be idle chit chat. Conversations could be about the projects that need to be done. So they're not necessarily about those sorts of things that will actually change or alter the psychological contract or the relationship between the manager and the team member. So let's look at that a little bit further. I think the most underrated, the underrated power is in the regular catch-up. Now, what I mean by the regular catch-up is that, in my experience, having worked across 21 industries and looked at outstanding leaders across those industries, there's several things that are common, but one of the things that are very common is that those managers find the time to actually have regular catch-ups with their team members. That is a really important point. And I think when I talk about this in workshops, people say, yeah, I get that, but busyness gets in the way, and all of a sudden I've got no time to sit down and have a chat with my team members because I'm too busy getting the product or the service organised. And therein lies a problem. So if we can get managers and employees to sit down and actually have conversations, developmental conversations, it will make a massive difference. It does make a massive difference. But of course, people have got to be convinced about that. And it's only when people actually get a chance to do it, when they realise how effective it can be. Now, the problem that people will often say to me is, yeah, I get it. I understand that it's all about the relationship, and I know that I should be doing this. But what do I talk about? Because it always goes back to the project that we're working on or whatever. And that therein lies an interesting question that they raise. So what I decided to do is to give people some things to talk about, to actually give people conversation points, topics to discuss, and I'm going to share that with you very shortly. So if we give people the conversation topics and even the questions, and we ask people to do this, I know from my own experience, we get incredibly great results, and those results are measurable. So we can actually quantify those results. We can see that trust goes up. We can see engagement goes up. We can see that performance goes up. We can see that understanding merges. A whole range of really important things happen that actually change that psychological contract between the manager and a particular employee. Not always, of course, but in lots of cases it does happen that way. So if you think about it this way, if you think about conversations on a continuum, so on the left-hand side, we've got idle chit-chat. Now, I'm not suggesting we shouldn't have idle chit-chat. Obviously, it's the lubricant that makes things work. Hi, how was your weekend? what did you do? You know, that those things are important. We human beings are social. So we do need to have idle chit chat. And I'm not suggesting we shouldn't do that. But if you go to the other end of the continuum on the right-hand side, we've got project-based conversations. Now, project-based conversations are about the job. It's about the work. And and of course, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have those either, because obviously things wouldn't happen. So at both ends of the continuum, those things do happen. But what doesn't happen, in my experience, enough of, is developmental conversations, which is right smack bang in the middle. And these catch-ups are the vehicle to be able to have these developmental conversations. So if you're trying to improve your relationship with your team members and all the good things that come from that, the place to start is with the developmental conversations, because I dare say you're having the social interactions on the left-hand side, and I'm sure you're talking to people about the projects on the right-hand side. So these things are probably happening anyway. But what's happening in the middle probably isn't happening to the extent that it could. So what I'm really proposing is a vehicle where we can actually indulge in more developmental conversations that will improve some of the aspects of culture that we've been talking about. Now, there are a number of things that get in the way of this, and I just wanted to quickly run through some things that get in the way of good conversations in the workplace. And I'm sure you and I are guilty of some of these things, but I just wanted to share them because it's all very well to say it's all about conversations, but there are things that will get in the way of having good conversations. Now, one of those things, of course, is inattention during a conversation. How often is it that we hear that we're supposed to be multitasking? So someone comes to the door and we're tapping on an email and we're looking up at the person at the door and say, go on, I'm listening, I'm listening. And of course, we're thinking to ourselves, we're going to get this email done at the same time I can talk to that person. But of course, the problem with that is that the email is probably not as effective as it could be. And the person at the door thinks that your email is more important than what they've got to say. So it's obviously not a great place to be. So when we're in a conversation, we need to be there. The second thing that can get in the way is restricted information channels. And what I mean by that is that people will say often, you'll get told on a need to know basis, or no news is good news. And that in itself is a problem. I'm not suggesting for a minute that there aren't things that should be kept from employees, but I think there are perhaps things that should be said that aren't said. And if we restrict the information channels to our particular people that we're working with, we can't expect them to be on the same level as we are in terms of their own perspective. So I think when in doubt, share information. And if you've got some doubt about it, have a think about it. But I think there's too much of this that goes on in workplaces. And of course, it works on the assumption that we can't trust employees, that they might keep it quiet or whatever. But the disturbing backstory around that is that it's okay that managers can be trusted, but not employees. And that doesn't send a great message to the rest of the workplace. So that's a barrier. Another barrier, of course, and I talk about this constantly, is a lack of feedback. We don't give people enough feedback. And if we don't give people positive feedback and we don't give people constructive feedback, how can they possibly know, are they meeting the expectations and your standards? So that's another impediment around having conversations. Another impediment is that we have a culture of not asking questions. So I often, probably it's a fair assumption to make that all of you in this session with me today probably have some education background, such as a trade or a degree or whatever it might be. The whole purpose of education is to teach people how to answer questions, and that's reasonable. But then when you get into a leadership position, your job is no longer around answering questions. It's actually about asking questions. So good leaders are in the business of asking questions, not answering questions. And I think a lot of people have a lot of trouble with that, to make that adjustment from being a technical expert to a leader. So that in itself can create a problem, because if you think about a good conversation, it is all about questions, question, answer, back and forward. Another thing that can be an impediment to conversations is too much formality. So if you have conversations in your office, if you have an office, that you'll feel extremely comfortable in that environment because it's your office. But will the other person feel comfortable in the office? And will they be willing to be open? And will they be willing to be psychologically safe with you when we're working together? Probably not likely. And I often say to people, the best conversations are outside the office, often, in a coffee shop or places like that. So too much formality can create a problem around having good conversations. Obviously, email had to come up. Surveys show that we spend at least 2.5 hours a day working on email. And I'm not suggesting that we should get rid of email. Email is a brilliant tool, but it's an asynchronous technology. The whole purpose of email is very simple, that when you send a message to someone else, they in their own time can respond to that. That's the genius of email. But unfortunately, what's happened is that we find that people are using email to have conversations with people. Not a good medium to do that, I'm sure you'd agree, but yet it happens all the time. And my strong suggestion to you, if you're a leader, is that the next time someone sends you an email, when they could just simply pick up the phone, fire up the Zoom, or just walk over and talk to you, then you should just gently challenge them and ask them why they've sent the email rather than talk to them directly. So, I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that. Of course, people covering their backside and all sorts of things. So we've got to be careful that email is one of the enemies of having these conversations that I'm talking about. So having an email protocol in your organization is really, really important in my view. Okay. Another issue in your workplace is a lack of role models. So clearly, if your leaders aren't, indulging in regular conversations about, various things, it's highly likely that you'll take your cue from your leaders and decide that it's not appropriate to do that. So this whole model starts with senior management. And if senior management aren't modeling conversation, then it's highly unlikely that the rest of the organization will do that. They'll just do what they see their leaders doing or not doing. And that becomes a problem as such. One of the big reasons we don't have conversations is the fear of emotion. We're worried about opening up a can of worms. Okay. Now, um, often that's fear in our head, that we are making an assumption that if we actually give someone some negative feedback, that they won't be able to handle it. Well, they might not, but how do we know unless we do it? And if we do it in an appropriate way, we might be pleasantly surprised that the person may well take that on board. But that's an inhibitor, isn't it, to having a good conversation? The final one is probably not a lot you can do about it, is your physical office layout. If it's open office plan, which in a lot of cases it is, that's actually a problem, because if someone wants to have a conversation with the person in the next cubicle, they know that there might be 20 other people that will hear that conversation, so they're less likely to indulge in that. So the paradox of the open office environment is it actually inhibits open communication. And by the time you book the meeting room, it's probably no longer important. So there are 9 factors that can get in the way that you might like to consider. So if you want to transform organizational culture, you must first improve the quality of conversation. That is my basic argument here. So the question then becomes, how do we do it? And what I'd like to do is share with you the framework for doing this. So I designed this framework many years ago, in fact, 2013, and I was looking at this as a replacement for the performance review. And many organisations took it on board and was very successful. But there seems to be, and this is part of the traditional psychological contract, that people still think we've got to have performance reviews. But there's no research anywhere that I've come across that demonstrate that performance reviews actually increase performance. So the question is, why do we do them? It's a good question to ask. But anyway, notwithstanding whether you can actually get rid of your performance reviews or not, you might use this as an enabler to improve a better performance review. So you'll notice on the left-hand side, there are 5 months. So each month has a theme, which is in the middle. And each of those themes have a series of questions that go with it. So if your organisation took on the 5 conversations framework, then it would be that in, say, the month of September, every single manager would sit down and have a regular catch-up on, say, climate review, if you started then. And then in October, they would then have a strengths and talents conversation. And then November, they'd have an opportunities for growth conversation. And they would have a learning and development conversation. And then they would have an innovation and continuous improvement conversation. So this process goes for 5 months. You might say, well, what happens after 5 months? Well, you go back to the start and you have another series of conversations. So what actually happens is that in an organisation that are taking this on board, they're having 10 developmental conversations every year with their direct reports. Now, just think about the difference that would make in your organisation if you could get people into that realm to do that. And this is what this is designed to do. So let me just share with you what these conversations are and some of the questions around it so you can get a sense of how they work. And of course, if you're thinking of doing this organisationally, I'd love to talk to you. If you're thinking about doing this individually, I'm happy to talk with you as well, because you can still apply this in your own team. So the climate review conversation isn't got obviously nothing to do with the weather, but the climate review conversation is how people are feeling at work, how their job satisfaction is, how their morale is, those sorts of things are considered. And so I've designed and crafted some questions, only 3 or 4 for each conversation. So each of these conversations should last for no longer than 20 minutes. People are skeptical about that, but if you stick to the 3 or 4 questions, you'll find that it'll go for 20 minutes. The good news is you can have a really good conversation in 20 minutes, really meaningful, and you can have a dead, dull and boring 2-hour conversation with someone and get nowhere. So it's not about the amount of time we spend as much as it is about the quality of the conversation. So the first question here is, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low, how would you rate your current job satisfaction? Now, obviously, job satisfaction ebbs and flows, but I'm asking people to give me a number out of 10. So let's say, for example, they gave me 6 out of 10. My next question is why? And now I've opened a doorway to a very interesting conversation about how people are feeling at work. And then the next question I'm going to ask is, do you ever think it could go from a 6 to a 7? Because the assumption could be that 6 is as good as it gets. So let's just check in with people. And they say, yes, it could go from a 6 to a 7. And then you as a leader can say, in order for it to go from a 6 to a 7, is there anything that I can do or not do that might make a difference? You see. So that's a really affirming conversation to start with. Organisations spend hundreds of thousands, in many cases, hundreds of thousands of dollars on these engagement surveys online. And the big criticism is that people spend 40 minutes going through this. They don't get any feedback about what came out of it. Nothing changes. People get cynical. And of course, the participation rate drops off each year if we do it annually. The second conversation around strengths and talents is really around starting with what people are actually good at. Let's start with what people are good at, which is a far more affirming place to start. Now, of course, if you said to someone, what is your strength? it's likely you'll get a very strange look. But if you said to someone, what's the one thing that you enjoy most about the work you do? That's the question that you ask in conversation too. Now, hopefully there's something, and I'm sure there will be. Whatever that person mentions, it is highly likely that they are good at that, because there's a high correlation between what we enjoy and what we're good at. So by asking people to explain what they're good at is often a case that they've actually unearthed their strength or their talent. The next question would be around, well, what is it that we might be able to do in your current situation to give you more opportunity to do that? So they might say they really enjoy the client interaction. What could we do, if anything? Now, it might be nothing, and that's okay, but at least we've had the conversation, and that's the good news about that. Opportunities for growth, of course, is on the other end of the spectrum, where we're talking about areas where people can improve. But in conversation 3, I want them to come to me with that opportunity for growth. I don't want to be sitting there saying to them, what's your opportunity for growth? And they say, oh, nothing, I can't think of anything. And then I end up filling the gap by giving them some feedback on what I think they should improve. Well, that doesn't work, because what it means is that I'm taking full ownership for their growth and they're taking none. So during these conversations, section prior to these conversations, we actually give people the questions. We want people to know what you're going to ask so that you can have a rich and meaningful conversation for 20 minutes in these catch-ups. So let's say someone says, oh, well, I've got to brush up on some skills around AI or something, whatever they might say. So they put that on the table, and then you discuss that a little bit more. So the next question would be, well, how is that going to improve your current role? How is it going to improve you in your current role? So we get some validation about why that growth opportunity is important for them and what they can do about it. Goes for 20 minutes and it's done. And then in conversation 4, you'll notice in conversation 2 and 3, we've talked about strengths and opportunities for growth. In conversation 4, we're having a learning and development conversation. So what we do is we tie back, we talk about what they said were their strengths and what they said were their opportunities for growth. And we try and put a little plan together over the next 6 months to help these people utilize their strength and also to overcome their opportunities for growth. Now, HR spends a lot of time each year doing what they call training needs analyses, and they send around the forms and people fill them out. Why don't we just do that at the coalface for 20 minutes twice a year? Can make a big difference. Now, whereas conversation 4, learning and development, is about the individual and their own development, conversation 5 is about the work setting itself. So it's about the innovation and continuous improvement conversation. So we talk about what people, so again, I want them to come to me with a thought, suggestion, and an idea. It doesn't have to be the Nobel Peace Prize, just something that they are happy, that they think it might be a notice board, might be more information about the meetings and what happened, a bit more communication around that. I'm not sure what it would be, but I'm willing to entertain those ideas. Not everything that will be brought up in the innovation and continuous improvement conversation will be a gem, but I'll guarantee to you, if you've got 6 conversations with 6 people, one suggestion will be well worth taking on board. And how do we determine whether that happens? So I get the person to explain that to me, and then I'm going to actually play devil's advocate, and I'm going to ask them, how much buy-in will we get for this idea? Because that's important. If we're going to get a lot of resistance, that's going to make things a bit tough. But if there's good buy-in, well, obviously that gets a tick. And then we might say, what's the cost of putting this in play? Now, obviously, if there's a huge cost, then, we might think twice about it. But if it's not a costly type of improvement, then of course there's another tick. And the third thing we might look at is the difference it will make in people's lives at work. And if we can actually illustrate that it'll make a big difference, then it gets a third tick. And, if it gets those three ticks, it's likely to be something that's quite a useful idea that could be thought about. So you implement that, and the other people in the team who are perfectly reasonable will understand that not everything that's mentioned in those meetings will get up. That's fine. So they understand that, but if they can see evidence that something's been implemented as a result of this developmental conversation, they're more likely to come up with something useful next time. So you can see how that works. So the five conversations framework works brilliantly. I know this because this has been implemented not only in Australia but all over the world. Cross-culturally, it works brilliantly. I'm chuffed to say. But we need a framework and we need a mechanism to make sure that people stay on track. Because when I put this together, I just assumed that people would be sold on it and off they go. Unlikely, because busyness gets in the way, as I said earlier. Let me show you some evidence of how effective it is. This is an organisation I worked in Brisbane. There were 640 employees in this organisation. And in this organisation, I actually surveyed, and you'll see part of the methodology is to survey. I surveyed the whole 600 plus people at the beginning, online, anonymously, and I simply asked them I gave them a series of statements. And what you're seeing in front of you is an aggregate result across this organisation. I won't mention its name, obviously. So, for example, the first one is the communication between management and staff is reasonably good most of the time. When we first surveyed this organisation, it was at 50%. It's not terribly great. It wasn't terrible. It wasn't terribly good either. Now, after one round of the five conversations, I'm talking five conversations where every single manager in this organisation sat down on a monthly basis and had these five conversations that I mentioned. After we did that, we surveyed everyone again. So this was obviously 5 or 6 months after. And then we found that that increased to 77%, which is a significant improvement, I'm sure you'd agree. Second one there, my boss has talked to me about ways to improve job satisfaction. That doubled. And so that's a good thing. And so the fact that they've had that conversation was really a valuable improvement in this. Couple more results you might like to have a look at. The boss has discussed my strengths and talents with me. Only 44% said yes. At the end, and of course, there's a conversation around that with 72%, but nevertheless, we got people talking about people's natural talents and strengths. Second one there, my boss gives me feedback on my strengths and talents. 43 raised to 61 after just 5 conversations, aggregate across the organisation. My boss is very aware of my strengths and talents, 47 to 67. That's a big improvement. So you can see that this has been a big improvement over just 5 20-minute conversations once a month. Let's have a look at a couple more and then we'll launch into how we put this in play. I have not received enough feedback on my work from my boss, so this was an inverse question. 36% said that, 72%. So this has actually doubled. So they now receive more feedback. This was after 5, because during these 5 conversations, people were able to talk about, the work, and they were able to give feedback on the spot. And so that doubled, which was a significant result. I feel my boss is getting the best out of me in my current role. Look at the difference there, 43 to 72. Incredible. And finally, I have discussed strategies to grow and develop in my current role with my boss, 40 to 55. So we have quantitative data and we also have qualitative data. So these are some comments that were written about the 5 conversations framework and the experience. Questions were not intrusive and could be delivered in a friendly manner. They provided an opportunity to learn more about individual team members. The conversations helped to break down barriers. to communication and enabled line managers to have more open conversations with team members. The 5 conversations framework has fostered more impromptu conversations with the team. That was an interesting comment. For example, discussions about what team members are working on. So trust was built, and that opened up more avenues for developmental conversations. Overall, the 5 conversations framework assisted in improving engagement, trust, and relationships for participants. So you can see and you might say, well, okay, is that all we've got to do? You have 5 20-minute conversations and everything's hunky-dory. No, because if you don't continue that process, then people will just recoil back to the old culture. But you can see the potential here that if these conversations are ongoing in an organization, a significant difference will occur. And of course, that will be sustainable over a period of time because the employee can actually see that this is a serious intervention. It's not just a little one-off process that we're working on. So just imagine your organization, as I said earlier, if every manager from CEO right through to leading hand, everything in between, every leader had 10 20-minute conversations, developmental conversations around the 5 conversations framework every year, what difference would that make to your culture? I think you would find it would make a significant difference. Absolutely significant difference, no doubt. So how does it actually get implemented? And we're just coming towards the end now. And if you've got some questions, I'd love to deal with those. But you might say, well, how do we implement it? You'll notice that up the top, we've got the first thing is to assess the workplace. And you saw some evidence of that in the organization I worked in. So we get a baseline. We try to understand what this psychological contract looks like. We try to understand that across the organization. We can segment it into departments and all the rest of it. So we get that data. And then the next step is that number 2 is we induct people. So everybody in the organization goes through a 2-hour induction. That induction can be done online or face-to-face. But we need to explain to people why we're doing this and what the benefits are for them. Otherwise, people will just think this is some de facto performance review in disguise. So we need to actually give people an understanding, and we share the data from the assessment in the induction as well. So everyone is right across the board and they understand exactly where they stand in relation to the questions that we ask. So there are 50 statements in the survey. So it doesn't take too long to fill out. And of course, we share that. There's coaching that goes on in this process. Now, I find that one of the most powerful things in this process is to do group coaching. So what I do when I go into an organization who are implementing the 5 conversations is we will get 5 managers together, preferably cross-functional, so we can actually break down the boundaries. And we actually just have an hour coaching session on what's working and what's not working in the conversations. And what I implement there is peer group learning. So we get people in that group to share their experience about how they're having. This is a management only type of approach that we're doing here. So someone might say, I can't get someone to shut up in their catch up. And someone says, have you tried paraphrasing? And the other person says, no, I haven't, but that sounds like a great idea. Well, and someone says, I can't get someone to speak up. And then someone says, have you tried silence or whatever it might be? And so they get to learn from each other in a collegial way, a very important part of the process. Every month I broadcast, like I'm doing now, but on one of the conversations. So for example, if people are working on, let's say, the climate review conversation this month, then at the end of this month, I will have a 30-minute webinar where I'm explaining and introducing the strengths and talents conversation, explaining to both the people on the receiving end and the people who will be actually facilitating that conversation what they can get out of that. So everybody gets an opportunity to have some just-in-time training around the next conversation. And the most powerful part of this is the implementation. This is where it really makes a huge difference, because people say, I need training before I have these conversations. Do you really? I mean, honestly, since we could talk, we've been trained how to have conversations. I mean, obviously, some conversations are difficult, but most conversations are pretty straightforward. I know some people are good at it and some people aren't, but there's only one way to improve, isn't there? Is to actually do it. So the 5 conversations framework is actually the training. So we're actually giving people an opportunity to practice and improve their leadership capabilities as well. Now, some will feel uncomfortable with this and some people will jump at it like a duck to water. But, part of the process of change is an expectation that managers will sit down and have these regular developmental conversations with their team members. And this is the framework to do it. And at the end of the process, say, for example, as I showed you before, we then assess the organisation again. And then we can compare the before and after snapshot, you see, so we can actually determine whether or not this has been good value for money. And I can assure you that inevitably the results are quite stunning. And so that creates a momentum. And then we continue it again for another round and another round and another round. And we continue until it becomes part of the process of how we do business. So somebody new in an organization gets inducted into understanding that they're expected to have these 5 conversations with their team members. And of course, we show them how to do that. Okay, so moving right along, mouse is frozen. There we go. So what are the benefits here? So let's just sum it up. One benefit is you've got ongoing dialogue. It's not a once in a blue moon a conversation around performance. So it's happening all the time. Another is that it's open and direct. So that's a good combination, isn't it? Open and direct. Not direct as in confrontational, but it's really getting to the source of and the heart of what's going on. Another important benefit of this is that it's flexible. You can do this on a park bench. You can do it in a car going from a client meeting. You can do this in a coffee shop. It's very, very flexible. And in fact, I encourage people to get out of the office and have these conversations. It's timely. So we get this information very quickly and we understand where people are at. And I think one of the most underrated benefits of this, it's more relaxed. There's not a performance review. We're having a one-on-one conversation about people's development. That's a good thing. And you'll find that the feedback is that the people on the receiving end will often be very grateful about this because they're spending more time with their manager. And that's a good thing. They don't, because all managers, let's face it, are very busy. So we're carving out time to develop our own people as such, which is very, very good. So just to sum up before we finish, the advantages of implementing this, you get a higher level of engagement without a doubt. You saw some results around that. If you don't do this, then of course, disengagement stays the same. You get more trust and collaboration. That is a fact. What you're doing is you're breaking down the them and us culture. And that's really important if we're really trying to change culture. You've got open communication. And of course, if you don't do this, you've got closed communication. Your attraction and retention figures will improve significantly. And of course, if you don't do this, higher turnover is inevitable. If you use this approach, you're improving leadership because you're giving people the skills to be better leaders. And if you don't do this, of course, the command and control leadership approach continues and pervades. You will gain greater productivity through it. And if you don't do this, of course,